Ah, we're on. Okay, surprise, surprise. I just looked up and saw the green light here. So we're continuing our discussion of Anglo-Saxon culture, with which we are beginning the course, as we talked about last time. And I was in the midst of talking about how two cultures are beginning to come together at this point in the early Middle Ages in what was eventually to become England. We had the northern culture, which had existed there from very, very early times. And remember that the Anglo-Saxons were themselves a Germanic people, not only in the sense that they spoke German or some version of German as their native tongue, but also in a cultural sense, that there were significant cultural differences between the peoples of Northern Europe, especially the Germanic and Celtic peoples, as distinguished from the peoples of the southern Mediterranean region with which most of us are most familiar. Right? I mean, that's the kind of thing that you usually study in school and so on. You know, what I tend to call the Mediterranean Rim, where you learn a lot about Greece and Rome. I mean, if you're studying ancient history anyway, you learn a lot about Greece and Rome, and you learn much less about what I sometimes call the rest of Europe during this whole period of late antiquity and then into the earlier Middle Ages. So, just to continue the discussion then, we have the native culture up in the north, which is now being transformed in certain ways by the missionary activity of these monks who are coming up, essentially from Italy or from the south of what is now France, and they are carrying out missionary activity to convert the peoples of England, the Germanic peoples of England, and the Celtic peoples who also lived in the British Isles, to Christianity. And at first, as I was mentioning last time, there were all kinds of resistances on both sides, and there are all kinds of culture conflicts going on. But these are gradually being negotiated. Sometimes those negotiations break down. There are times when people will convert to Christianity, and then after a generation they'll decide that wasn't such a good idea after all, and they'll go back to the old religion. And then that will happen for another generation or two, and then people will come along and they'll say, well, maybe we really were better off with Christianity after all, and they will reconvert to Christianity. So I guess what I'm getting at here is that it wasn't a smooth evolutionary process. It was a process that was sometimes fraught with difficulty and tension, and then sometimes it went very smoothly. So that this is the kind of thing that can easily happen when you have two cultures which do not really coincide in lots of ways, that are trying to negotiate their differences in more or less peaceable ways, in really forming a new kind of culture, which is neither just the one nor just the other. So, we move on. And the next really important thing that happens to the peoples of England happens in 793 with the coming of the Vikings, the Scandinavian Vikings. And the Scandinavian Vikings are essentially raiders. The Old Norse word Vikingur means raider. It can even mean something like pirate, but in its more positive connotations, it means something like a raider. And the Scandinavian peoples, for various reasons, not the least of which was that they were running out of land, began to move out of Scandinavia, and they began to raid along the northern eastern coast of England, around the rim of Scotland, down the eastern coast of England. They got over to Ireland and raided mainly around the coastal areas of Ireland, where, by the way, it was the Scandinavian Vikings who founded Dublin, now the capital of Ireland. And as a matter of fact, just a few years ago, they were doing that is to say, the Irish were doing a major construction project in downtown Dublin along the Liffey River. And as they were digging down to establish the foundations for one of the buildings, they ran into all of these very early medieval Viking materials and artifacts. And they had to stop the construction project long enough for the archaeologists to come in and do a proper excavation, and were able to save all of that Viking material from very, very early history of Dublin. So the Vikings spread out all over the North Sea and North Atlantic area. They eventually went down into France, where in the 10th century, Rollo the Viking was able to conquer what now is known as Normandy. Some of you may know this, that the term Norman really means men of the north. And the reason why Normandy is called Normandy is because it was then taken over by the men of the north, or the Scandinavian Vikings. They probably could have taken over most, if not all, of France, by the way, because they were far superior militarily to the people who were there, except that the French king, who was a very shrewd politician, went to Rollo the Viking and said, "Rollo, have I got a good deal for you? You guys stay where you are. You can have Normandy." Very generous of him, by the way, since they already controlled Normandy. "You can have Normandy, and I'll tell you what, I will make you a French duke. And all of your people will now be French citizens." And they thought about it for a while, and they said, "That's a pretty good deal." And so they more or less peaceably accepted this settlement. And within a generation or two, they learned French, and they spoke a special dialect of French, which is known as Norman French. And that was the version of French that was brought over to England during the Norman conquest of England in 1066, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. The Vikings continued on down the coastline. They raided along the peninsula, the Iberian Peninsula, where Portugal and Spain are. They got over to Italy. They established a kingdom in the island of Sicily, off the western coast of the Italian peninsula. And they even got as far as the eastern end of the Mediterranean. So the Vikings were a major, major force in the early Middle Ages. And then gradually their power receded. And one of the ways that it receded was through military resistance being developed to the Vikings. And in England, this happened when the Vikings had taken over. By the middle of the 800s, the Vikings had taken over almost all of England, with the exception of one small corner in the southwest known as Wessex. And there, a young man became the king of Wessex, which really wasn't a very big deal at that time because there wasn't much of Wessex left to be the ruler over. And his name was Alfred, and as Winston Churchill pointed out in his multi-volume history of the English people, Alfred is the only English monarch who has ever been designated the Great. So Alfred the Great became king in 871. He lived to 899. And in the first couple of decades of his reign, he was able to mount a successful counterattack or series of counterattacks against the Vikings and drive them back to the north and east of England, and eventually come to terms with them and establish a diagonal line cutting from the northeast to the southwest of England. No, excuse me, from the northwest to the southeast of England. And so the lower part of England was controlled by Alfred and his people, and then the upper part of England along that divide was settled and controlled by Scandinavians. Now it's important to keep that in mind because once again we have two great cultures coming together. The Scandinavians and the Anglo-Saxons were really cousin peoples to one another. They were simply different branches of the North Germanic peoples. So culturally they had a lot in common, despite the fact that they were at war with one another during much of this period. And they also spoke a sufficiently common language that they could speak to one another without translators. Now, the English and the Scandinavians, by the way, could not speak to the Irish, say, without translators, because the Germanic tongues and the Celtic tongues are sufficiently different that people who know one language cannot speak the other without going through special preparation and training. But the Scandinavian Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons in England could speak to one another without the need for translators. And it would be very much like if you or I were to go to another part of the world where English is spoken, but the dialect is pretty far removed from ours. Say, in some of the remoter parts of Australia, for example. Certainly people speak English, but they would speak English in a different way than we would. And so we'd have to sort of tune our ears to catch on to their dialect. Or in Belize, some of you may know of Belize, one of the Central American countries, which for many, many years was a British colony. And so most of the people of Belize speak English, but they speak a very specific dialect of English, which is very heavily influenced, obviously, by Spanish, which the people also speak as they do throughout Central America. So it would be something like that, where you would be able to negotiate the linguistic divide, but you might have to do, some working at it. But again, there were periods of relative peace, despite the fact that Alfred's son and grandsons carried out what they called the reconquest of England and eventually subdued the Vikings in the north. Nevertheless, there were long periods in which people intermarried, and there was an Anglo-Scandinavian culture that developed in the northern and especially in the northeastern part of England. And it is probably from that Anglo-Scandinavian culture that Beowulf came. And we'll talk more about that when we get to Beowulf. So, it's also interesting when you think about these different people intermarrying that there was a will that had to be probated in York, in Durham, which is in the north of England in the 11th century. And the local bishop was assigned the task of probating the will. And it had to do with who was going to inherit what property according to who was related to whom. Because when you're talking about inheritance rights, you have to be able to trace genealogies, right? Who is related to whom, in what ways, by what degrees, and so forth. And so we have this very elaborate genealogical chart being worked out in the probating of this will, in which we find out that in this family, which was a very large extended family, the family consisted of members who were roughly 1/3 Anglo-Saxon or English, roughly 1/3 Scandinavian, and roughly 1/3 Celtic, mostly Irish, which is very interesting in terms of seeing how these different cultures were coming together. And that's much of what we're going to be talking about as we talk about the earlier English periods. Because up until roughly the time of Shakespeare, England and the development of English culture is always going to be involved in negotiating different kinds of cultural differences in ways that we'll be talking about for the next couple of weeks. So, eventually, we have even Scandinavians who become kings of England. There are 3 in a row who become kings of England, the first one of which is a guy named Canute, and then his two sons. And one of whom is named Harefoot. Hare as in the rabbit, Harefoot, which is sort of interesting. And the other one is Harthacnut. And so anyway, the last of the sons eventually dies, and then there is a restoration of the old Wessex line of Alfred under a king known as Edward the Confessor. He dies, there's civil war, and eventually a certain Harold Godwinson, Harold becomes Harold of England, gets himself crowned king, and along the way it would appear that Edward, Harold's predecessor, had made some kind of a deal with William of Normandy, who, by the way, was known to many of his contemporaries as William the Bastard, because he was, quote, officially an illegitimate child, but he eventually came to be known as William the Conqueror, which was a much nicer title for him, and the one that he actually much preferred. And it would appear, and some historians believe, that there was some sort of a secret deal between Edward the Confessor, King of England, and William of Normandy, that William would succeed because he was related, distantly related, to the English royal house, and Edward didn't have any children. So there's always a question of succession when you have a monarchical system and you don't have a system like ours in which we have a pretty orderly process for the succession. But what happens if you live in a monarchical system and the eldest child, usually a son, but the eldest child, will succeed to the throne, and then you have no children? Well, that always leads to complications, sometimes difficulties, even civil wars, as has many times happened in the history of England, by the way. So, what eventually is worked out then is that Harold becomes king. William of Normandy is by no means pleased by this. There also is some evidence from a tapestry in the French town in Normandy of Bayeux, which is known, therefore, as the Bayeux Tapestry. And it's a tapestry which goes around a room now about the size of this room. If you can imagine a tapestry which is about this high, okay, it's not a great big wall hanging tapestry. It's a tapestry about this high, stitched with figures that are sort of like our cartoon figures because they're mainly outline figures. And then there are Latin words or phrases or sentences that are stitched in there with the figures so that you can follow the narrative all the way through. The Battle of Hastings, which was the battle in which William became the conqueror of England and Harold was killed. But you can follow the narrative from years and years and years before the Battle of Hastings, and it would appear that Harold at one point went to Normandy, and you can see him receiving a sword from William, which in medieval times meant that you were placed under the lordship of the person who gave you your sword. So again, you know, it would appear that maybe William had, or at least believed that he had, a claim to the throne of England. In any event, he did invade England in October of 1066, and on October 14th, William's forces defeated Harold's forces at or near a place called Hastings in the south of England, and this is the famous Battle of Hastings, and that was the beginning of the end of Anglo-Saxon rule, because from that point on, over the next several decades, the Normans were able to establish, not all at once, but were able to establish by taking over in this area and then taking over in that area through a series of battles and political negotiations and so forth, all of England. And they subjugated the Anglo-Saxon peoples to the new Norman leadership, which brought about an immense cultural change. Because notice that while the Normans had been originally Scandinavians and therefore cousin peoples to the Anglo-Saxons, they now had become, in many ways, more French than the French. And what they brought with them to England was not only the French language, but also French culture, which in some ways was very different from the kind of culture that existed in England. And we'll talk more about that as we go along. But that brought about a profound change in the language of English. And it transformed English in the direction of what English has become in modern times. And I'll talk more about that a little bit later on. But I'll just give you this one little hint right now. About a third of our vocabulary comes from French. About a third, which is very interesting. That's one of the reasons why it's relatively easy for English speakers to learn French. I'm not talking about, all the little grammatical rules, but I'm talking about, just learning a lot of vocabulary. You already know a lot of vocabulary, whether you know it or not. And it's relatively easy for French speakers to learn English. And again, I'm not talking about all the niceties of grammar here. Do you use the subjunctive here or not? That sort of thing. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about just learning basic vocabulary and basic communication. So, that's the kind of culture and culture difference and culture negotiating that's taking place among these different peoples. Let me just talk a little bit about one other source of information about Anglo-Saxon culture and the kind of people these were. And I'm going to turn to a source that most people would not even think of going to. I'm going to go to a law code. This is the earliest law code that has survived from Northern Europe. It was written down in 602, 603. 602, 603? We're talking about something very, very, very early. During the reign of King Ethelred, which is spelled pretty much the way it sounds, Ethelred, who was the king of Kent when St. Augustine led his missionaries from Italy up to England, and remember I talked about this last time, went into Kent and found the king and his Christian queen in their seat at Canterbury, which was in effect the capital of Kent. Kent, by the way, for those of you who are a little hazy on English geography, is in the southeast of England, and so it's just right across from France, by the way. Very short distance, in fact, between France and the coast there at Kent. And so St. Augustine had gone in, converted the king with the help of the king's Christian wife, and many of the people of Kent then converted to Christianity. Canterbury became the first seat of an archbishop of Canterbury, who became the head of the Church of England from an ecclesiastical point of view. And the reason why I qualify that is that, as some of you know, much later on in the 16th century, Henry VIII is going to proclaim himself as King of England, the head of the Church of England. But that's another story which we'll get to a little bit later on. And so this Ethelred was king over a people who very likely were not literate. But with the coming of the Christian missionaries, literacy also was introduced into those areas where missionary activity took place and people converted to Christianity. Now, the Germanic peoples had a writing system of their own, but it was only used for monuments and for very short kinds of memorial messages, like on gravestones and that sort of thing. It wasn't used in the way we think of writing. It wasn't used for writing whole documents. It certainly wasn't used for producing books, even in manuscript form. And this is the writing system known as the runes. The runes, and some of you probably have heard of the runes. By the way, the Celtic peoples had a parallel system of writing, but it also was only used on stones and engraving memorial references like so-and-so died here and such a date and so forth. And it's known as Ohm. And it's actually not too awfully different from the Germanic rune system. But in any event, a real writing system had been developed at a relatively early time in the ancient Mediterranean world. And we usually credit the Phoenicians for developing our kind of alphabet system, though writing did not begin with the Phoenicians. It was much older than that. And eventually this was picked up by the Greek-speaking world, and then, of course, by the Romans. And from there, it was transported to many parts of the Western world. So literacy now comes with the Christian missionaries to England, and was probably only very, very spotty up until that time, and probably confined pretty much to those little remaining pockets of Christianity that I talked about last time, that would have been left over from before the Anglo-Saxon invasion. So, here, very shortly after Ethelbert's conversion, 5 to 6 years, we have laws that would have gone back to oral tradition. We're going to talk a lot about oral tradition in the next little while, by the way. Oral tradition. And passed on through oral tradition from person to person, group to group, generation to generation, until finally they get written down. So these are much more ancient than 602, 603. It's just that this is when they got written down. Now, an oral culture is one in which, what anthropologists usually call this, by the way, is a traditional culture. But an oral culture is one in which people don't have writing, or at least the majority of people don't have writing, and their primary form of communication, therefore, is face-to-face oral communication, like this, what you and I are engaged in right now. And that means that the whole memory, not only of individuals, but collectively of social groups, has to be retained within the collective memory of the people living at any given time, right? I mean, everything you need to know has to be retained in memory, because it can't be committed to books. You can't store information in books. Right? Think of how different, how fundamentally different the mentality of such a society is from the mentality of a society like ours. We have vast technologies for storing information. We don't have to remember everything, do we? Maybe once in a while for a test. But other than that, we don't have to hold vast amounts of information in our heads. We can put it in books. We can now put it on computer disks. There are all kinds of ways in which we can not only save information, but retrieve information when we need to. What about a primary oral culture? They have to know everything. They have to know how to fish. They have to know how to hunt. They have to know which plants are poisonous, which ones are okay to eat, how to cook them, what to do if somebody breaks an arm, how to birth babies, you know, what do you do if mother's milk is not flowing? What do you do if somebody has indigestion? How do you make spears? How do you make arrowheads? How do you grind your flour? How do you make fire? I mean, just endless things that you would have to know, right? If you are a seagoing people, you have to learn how to navigate. And you don't have modern navigation techniques. There are peoples in the Pacific. Unfortunately, they're beginning to die off because this is something known by the older people, but not being passed on to enough of the younger people, perhaps to survive very long, where some of the South Sea Islanders can go over hundreds and hundreds of miles of the Pacific Ocean without any navigation instruments whatsoever, in our sense of navigation instruments, but simply by knowing how to observe the movements of the waves and the currents. And they'll end up across 800 miles of ocean, dead on exactly the island that they set out for. And it's absolutely amazing. Okay, how do you do this? And how do you pass it on? This has to be passed on from one generation to another so that that lore is not lost, right? When things like Beowulf or Homer's epics and so forth come to be written down, having been originally composed and circulated in oral communities and circulating in oral communities for a very long time before they get written down, we still see all of the traces of their original orality, in their original oral composition, and the signs of their oral circulation, something we will talk about when we get to Beowulf. Okay, so now let's talk about the law codes. I'm going to make an analogy with another Germanic people, the people of Iceland. The people in Iceland would gather once a year in the summertime at what was called the Althing. A thing, by the way, in Old Norse is an assembly. And the Althing was the assembly of all the people, or anybody who wanted to come anyway, to the Althing. And at the Althing, there was a rock, which is up at a high elevated place, known as the Logberg, the Law Rock. And there the Logsagumather, the law-saying man, would get up on the Logberg, the Law Rock, and he would recite 1/3 of the law of the people of Iceland. And then the next year, he would recite the next third. And then the third year, he would recite the third of the law of Iceland. And in the meantime, they would have all kinds of courts going on with court proceedings, deciding cases. But this is all on oral tradition and orally circulating law. The law speaker, by the way, wasn't a judge. I mean, he wasn't like our Supreme Court judge or something like that. What he was a living library. If you wanted to figure out, well, wait a minute now, there are certain technicalities here in this law case, you go to the law speaker and the law speaker will say, yes, such and such is the law. He's the law library, in effect. So it's very interesting. And they carried this on for centuries through oral tradition without anything being written down, until once again they came in contact with the Christian missionaries who brought writing. So, and then of course things did get written down in the forms that they've come down to us. So let me go back to Ethelbert's laws. And because writing had been brought, first of all, by the Christian missionaries, the laws begin with talking about the rights and prerogatives of the church and of the various officials in the church, probably a recent innovation with the coming of the Christian missionaries. But then there are all sorts of things here, like if the king orders his men to assemble, and anyone does evil to them there, that person shall pay double compensation, that is to say, double the compensation that would ordinarily be required, a kind of fine, ordinarily required for some kind of disturbance of the peace. Because what you're doing is not just disturbing the peace, you're disturbing the king's peace and the assembly called by the king. And 50 shillings to the king. And a shilling, by the way, was a silver coin about this big, about the size of our quarter. But it was worth a fair amount of money in those times. It's hard always to figure out, what do certain monetary values today correspond to if we go back to, say, Queen Elizabeth's time, or back to the early Middle Ages, or back to ancient Rome, or something like that. What economic historians usually do is they'll look at specific commodities. Like they'll say, okay, how much did a loaf of bread cost? And compute what does a loaf of bread cost today to us, and then what did a loaf of bread cost to them. And you try to work out equivalences like that. And if you do enough of these with enough different commodities, also computing the rarity, scarcity, or plentifulness of those commodities, then you can begin at least to get some idea. But in any event, this would have been a lot of money. Now, one of the things you're going to see throughout this law code is, how do people resolve problems? The assumption among legal anthropologists, this is a whole very interesting field, by the way, legal anthropology. The assumption among legal anthropologists is, we're going to have problems sometimes, aren't we? Sometimes we're going to get into disputes. Sometimes people are going to even injure one another, possibly even kill somebody. How do you resolve the dispute? Let's take something very serious. Let's say that somebody were to kill me. Well, my brothers would then be honor-bound to go and kill that person, right? But having killed that person, then his relatives are honor-bound to come and kill one of mine, and so forth. Now, probably, my side would have a certain advantage since I have 7 brothers, but I really do. So we'd have some numerical advantage in this game. But notice, the problem with feuds is that there's no way to stop it. You see, it just keeps going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so the whole institution of law and of law courts and of negotiation is an attempt to try to resolve conflict. The assumption being that in all human societies, from families to governments, we're going to have disputes and we're going to have conflicts at some times, right? What's interesting is not conflict. What is interesting from this point of view is conflict resolution. How does a particular culture go about trying to resolve conflict and lessen conflict and negotiate settlements of conflict when they arise? Well, one of the ways in which this society did that is by paying compensation. If I in some way wrong you, I am obliged to pay you compensation. Okay? Now, that's negotiable. To a certain extent anyway, that's negotiable. It was formalized, as you'll see in this document, but also it's negotiable. So that, let's say, somebody killed me, and then the person who did the killing comes to my brothers and says, well, look, I did it, and, I'm willing to pay compensation, and I'll give you $5,000. You say, $5,000? You've got to be kidding. This is our brother. We love this guy. And the guy says, well, all right. I know that's too small. How about $50,000? $50,000? You think you're going to buy us off for $50,000? And the guy comes back and says, okay, you're right. How about $1 million? And he starts saying, well, well, yeah, you know, we loved our brother, but $1 million is $1 million. And so they accept the settlement, what was known as were-gild. Were was the Anglo-Saxon word for man, like in werewolf. That's the only survival I know of the word. But where is the Anglo-Saxon word for, or one of the Anglo-Saxon words for a man? And where, gild is cognate with the German gilt, which means money. And our gilded, you know, like something which is gilded with golden colors and so forth. So anyway, where gild is the money that a man's life would be worth. Now obviously that's going to vary depending upon the man and the station of the man and what the man owns or has and so forth. And that became kind of a baseline for figuring everything else. But the essential idea is that when one person has offended another, the way to resolve conflict is through negotiating compensation. And they tried to formalize this as much as possible. So I just gave you an example from a person who disturbs the peace in an assembly called by the king. But then there are other things like this. If a man lies with an earl's female cupbearer, he shall pay 12 shillings compensation. What's not clear is to whom does he pay the compensation? To the woman or to the earl, who presumably is a man? And we have various other things like this. If a man is the first to forcibly enter another man's homestead, he shall compensate with 6 shillings. The next one to enter somebody's homestead shall pay 3 shillings. Each one afterward shall pay 1 shilling. I mean, it's an interesting logic, isn't it? If a group of people come to break into your house, the one who breaks in first, the one who breaks the lock or breaks the door, is the one who is most liable. The one immediately after him is next liable, and then anybody after that is liable, but to a lesser degree. Okay? And then if someone provides a man with weapons where quarreling has arisen, not just did the deed, but supplied weapons to somebody, and the man receiving the weapons does no injury, the weapons supplier shall pay compensation of 6 shillings, even though no injury was created. He gave the person a weapon that could have created an injury. Okay? If highway robbery is committed, the weapons supplier shall pay compensation of 6 shillings. If a man is slain, the weapons supplier shall pay compensation of 20 shillings, and so forth. And it goes on and on and on with property and so forth, but the most interesting parts of this have to do with personal injuries. You know, personal injury lawyers in our time make an awful lot of money out of dealing with personal injuries. Okay, here are the kinds of personal injuries. This goes on for pages with these things. I'm not going to read you all of this. But if someone if someone seizes a man by the hair, 50 sheatas compensation. Now a sheata is roughly the size of a dime, but that still was a lot of money in those days. If someone lays bare a bone, 3 shillings compensation. If someone injures a bone, 4 shillings compensation. If the outer covering of the brain, apparently the scalp is meant here, is broken, 10 shillings compensation. If both the skull and the brain are damaged, 20 shillings compensation. If a shoulder is lame, 30 shillings compensation. If either ear is struck deaf, 25 shillings compensation. If an ear is struck off, 12 shillings compensation. Apparently, if you make somebody deaf, that is more serious than if you simply cut off his ear. Because I don't know very much about, hearing, I mean, from a medical point of view. But apparently you can still hear if you don't have this outer ear. Maybe not as well, but you can still hear. So it's not quite as serious as actually making somebody deaf. If a hole is made in the ear, 3 shillings compensation. If an ear is sheared, 6 shillings compensation. And then if an eye is struck out, now it's going to go way up, right? Because losing an eye is more serious than losing an ear. If an eye is struck out, 50 shillings compensation. If the mouth or eye is made crooked, 12 shillings compensation, and so on and so on and so on. I mean, this is incredibly elaborate. The one who breaks a chin bone, not a shin, but a chin bone, will pay compensation with 20 shillings. That's fairly serious because you're impairing somebody's ability to speak and to eat, right? For each of the 4 foremost, that is to say front teeth, 6 shillings. The tooth that stands next to each of these, 4 shillings. The one that then stands next to each of these, 3 shillings. Each one after 1 shilling. So see, what you start with is you start with the front teeth are worth the most if they get knocked out. And then you proceed backwards and they become of less and less value as you go back into the person's mouth. If a thumb is struck off, 20 shillings. Well, that's pretty serious, a thumb. If a man strikes off a shooting finger, which is the forefinger, the shooting finger for the bow and arrow, he shall pay 9 shillings. See, that's not anywhere near as serious as striking off a thumb. If a man strikes off a middle finger, that's worth a little bit more than the forefinger, so that's 4 shillings. If a man strikes off a gold finger, that's the ring finger, 6 shillings, so it goes up again. But then this is interesting. If a man strikes off the little finger, it goes all the way up to 11 shillings. In other words, the compensation almost doubles. And you might wonder, well, why a little finger? Well, have you ever hurt your little finger? You know, and you couldn't use it, or you couldn't use it very well, or it was very painful if you tried to use your little finger? Well, if you haven't, you're lucky. Let me just say, if it ever happens to you, it becomes almost crippling. I mean, it's very difficult to use the rest of your hand without your little finger. So anyway, and then for each fingernail, 1 shilling compensation. And then we've got disfigurements to the face, bruises, whether the bruise is something that's visible to people or something that is covered by clothing. In the first case, it would be worth a lot more in compensation because it shows, right? Whereas if it's covered by your clothing, it's not as serious an injury. And stomach wound, 12 shillings compensation. If a hole is made, 20 shillings compensation. A hole in the stomach, by the way. If a man needs medical care, 30 shillings compensation. If a man injures the sexual limb, the original is actually branch, which is interesting. He shall pay the injured man 3 times the man's weregild. That is to say, 3 times the amount that he would have to have paid if he had killed the man. This is not only to discourage such injuries, but it's also presumably you have made the man incapable of procreating. So you have killed potentially more or harmed more than just one person. Who knows? Anyway, but if he only pierces through it, then 6 shillings in compensation. If he thrusts into it without going all the way through, 6 shillings compensation. And then we go down to the ribs, we go to the thigh, we go to the foot, we go to each one of the toes, and of course you can imagine, again, as with the fingers and the teeth, there are different assessments of compensation for different toes. And so then we go to things like we have a man, by the way, under the law, what you would do if you wanted to marry a woman, there would be a certain bride payment that would be made, and there would be an exchange of goods between the two families, the family of the prospective husband and the family of the prospective bride. And by the way, the woman had control over the household goods. One of the things that we know from graves and grave goods, again, archaeology, by the way, is that when women were buried, and this is one of the ways you can sometimes tell whether it was a man's grave or a woman's grave, with a woman's grave, the keys would be buried, or replicas of the keys, to signify that it was the woman's role to have control over the goods of the house. And the woman would actually keep a kind of chest, with a lock on it. And she would be the one who would retain the key, not the man. And then if they're divorced, notice there are provisions here for child support, as I was mentioning last time. If she bears a living child, she shall have ownership of half the property. Okay? Or if the husband dies, it's not a divorce, but the husband dies, she has control of half the property if she has borne a child. If she wishes to leave with the children from her husband, if there's a divorce, she shall have a share of she shall have half of the property. If the husband wishes to leave with the children, she shall have a share of the property equal to a child's share. But she would still get some share, even though he now has custody of the children. And this goes on with these different kinds of arrangements. And by the way, you can imagine some of the monks coming up from the Mediterranean South were horrified by this kind of thing. Because to a large extent, not entirely, because as I said last time, Northern Europe was not a feminist paradise by any means, but to a large extent there are all kinds of protections for women, including legal protections for women, that did not exist elsewhere. And so this kind of law code goes on. Why law code? After all, isn't this supposed to be an English class? Well, we try to find out what we can about the culture that produces a literature, right? I mean, these works don't come out of nowhere. They come out of a living, breathing culture with real live people like you and me. And what kind of culture do these people have? What kinds of cultural values do they have? How do we find out? Well, one interesting way to find out is by taking the perspective of a legal anthropologist and looking at the laws, looking at how people resolve conflict through a system of law and negotiation and mediation and so forth, tells us a great deal about that culture. As we can infer many things now about this culture just by looking at this law code, not the least of which is that it clearly is a culture in which personal injuries must have taken place fairly frequently and were taken very seriously, but also the effort to compensate was taken equally seriously. Okay.